"I have been keeping count," he said. "Every barn, every cold morning you walked out of someone else's hayloft and pretended you had slept somewhere warm, snow melting off the collar of her coat, her mare's breath white in the dark, his hands still covered in the blood from the work they had just finished together. Tacy Briggs was 36 years old and sleeping in other people's barns to keep one horse fed. One horse that a livestock agent named Vernell Loomis said belonged to him now on account of a debt she had never signed for and paperwork she had never seen. She had lost her millinery shop in Savannah when her partner vanished with the accounts. She had lost her room in Willow Bend when the money ran out. What she had left was a mare, a reputation for making soup stretch, and the particular kind of invisibility that settles over a woman once the world decides she is no longer worth the trouble of seeing. The quilting circle met Tuesdays above the Mercantile. The drifting horseman, who never spoke more than 4 words at a time, had been rebuilding a line shack all autumn, board by board, in a wind that cut through everything. So why would a man who could barely say his own name in a crowd keep count of her cold mornings for 3 months without telling her? 3 months earlier, the first leaves had just started to turn. Tacy Briggs walked into the church kitchen at 4:30 in the morning because the soup would not make itself. 40 pounds of root vegetables, a ham bone the butcher's wife had set aside, water from the pump that took 11 hard strokes to prime when the nights got cold. She was 36 years old. The women who ran the quilting circle above the Mercantile called her capable, which was the word they used when they meant unmarried and unlikely to change. The men at the feed store called her nothing at all because a woman without property was not worth the trouble of naming. She had come to Willow Bend 7 months ago with 2 trunks, a mare, and the paperwork from a dissolved millinery partnership in Savannah. Her business partner had vanished the same week the accounts did. What Tacy had left was a bill of sale for a horse, a letter of reference from a minister who had since died, and hands that knew how to work. The soup kitchen had given her a room above the storeroom. Then the church had needed that room for something else. Then the boarding house had raised its rates. Then the boarding house had raised them again. So what did she do next? She found barns. Families who would let her sleep in the hay in exchange for mending, for cooking, for the kind of work that did not need to be named because everyone understood what it meant when a woman had nothing left to trade but labor. She kept her mare fed. She kept herself clean. She walked into the church kitchen every morning at 4:30 as though she had slept somewhere warm, and no one asked questions because no one wanted to know the answers. The first time she saw Hamilton Ketcham, he was standing at the back of the feed store with his hat pulled low, waiting for a bag of oats. She noticed 3 things: his hands, which were calloused in the particular way that meant he worked with rope and leather; his silence, which was not the silence of a man who had nothing to say, but the silence of a man who had decided not to say it; and the way he stepped aside when she came through the door, not with the exaggerated courtesy some men used to make a woman feel small, but with the plain economy of a man who simply did not want to be in anyone's way. He was 40 years old. She learned this later from the clerk at the Mercantile, who mentioned it in the same breath as the information that he was rebuilding a line shack 12 miles out, and that he had been in town since spring, and that no one knew where he had come from or why he had stopped drifting. The second time she saw him, she was hauling water for the soup. The pump had frozen overnight. She was working the handle with both hands, her breath white in the October air, her shoulders burning with the effort of trying to break the ice loose in the pipe. She had been at it for 6 minutes when she heard boots on the packed dirt behind her. He did not ask if she needed help. He did not introduce himself. He simply reached past her, wrapped one hand around the handle, and worked it in a short, hard rhythm until the water came. Then he stepped back, touched the brim of his hat, walked away without a word. That was the first small thing she noticed about Hamilton Ketcham. He did not wait to be thanked. Mrs. Harwell, who sat in the front pew every Sunday and organized the quilting circle, stopped Tacy outside the Mercantile the following Tuesday. "I heard you have been sleeping in the Dawson barn," she said. Her voice was not unkind. That was almost worse. "I heard your horse is the only reason you are staying." Tacy did not answer. Mrs. Harwell smoothed her gloves. "A woman your age," she said, "without family, without means. It is not a position that invites confidence, Miss Briggs. People talk. I am aware of what people do." Mrs. Harwell looked at her for a long moment. The wind cut between the buildings, sharp with the smell of coming snow. "The quilting circle meets Tuesdays," she said finally, "above the Mercantile. We could use another pair of hands if you are willing." It was not an invitation. It was a test. Tacy understood the difference. She understood that Mrs. Harwell wanted to see whether she would come, whether she would sit quietly among women who had homes and husbands and standing, whether she would accept the particular kind of charity that came with being watched. She went anyway. The third time she saw Hamilton Ketcham, he was outside the Mercantile, loading lumber into a wagon. She was climbing the stairs to the quilting circle. He looked up as she passed. He did not speak. He did not nod. But he paused in his work just for a moment and watched her until she reached the top of the stairs and disappeared inside. That was the second small thing she noticed about him. He saw her when no one else was looking. The autumn deepened. The line shack 12 miles out grew walls, then a roof, then a door that latched against the wind. The soup stretched further every week. The barn floors grew colder, and somewhere in the space between the feed store and the quilting circle and the frozen pump, Tacy Briggs began to understand that she was being counted, that someone was keeping track of the mornings she walked out of other people's haylofts, that someone had noticed the particular kind of cold that settles into a woman who has stopped expecting warmth. She told herself it meant nothing. The pump took 11 hard strokes to prime when the nights got cold. But the morning after she saw him loading lumber, she arrived at 4:30, and the water was already flowing. Someone had been there before her. The handle was wet with recent use. She thought nothing of it. The church sexton, perhaps. The minister's wife, who sometimes came early to pray. The next morning the same, and the next. By the fourth morning she began arriving at 4. The water was already primed. By the fifth she arrived at 3:30. The handle was still warm. So who was walking to the church before dawn, in the dark, in the cold, to prime a pump for soup that would feed men he did not know? She found out on the 6th morning. Hamilton Ketcham was standing at the pump when she came around the corner of the church. His back was to her. His hands were wrapped around the handle, working it in that same short, hard rhythm she remembered from October. Steam rose from his breath in the lamplight. He did not hear her approach, or perhaps he did, and chose not to turn. She stood in the dark and watched him finish, watched him test the flow, watched him wipe his hands on his coat and turn toward the road that led out of town, toward the line shack 12 miles away that was still missing half its windows. He saw her then. Neither of them spoke. The silence stretched between them like the first ice forming on still water. He touched the brim of his hat. She inclined her head. He walked away. That was the third small thing she noticed about Hamilton Ketcham. He did not expect to be caught. The ritual established itself without discussion. She stopped trying to arrive before him. He stopped trying to leave before she arrived. Instead, there was a moment each morning, brief and wordless, where they stood on opposite sides of the pump and acknowledged what was happening between them. Nothing was happening between them. She told herself this every night in whatever barn she slept in, her mare's breath warm against her neck, the cold seeping up through the hay. She told herself this every morning when she saw him at the pump, his hands steady on the handle, his silence wrapped around him like armor. He was a drifting horseman, with no family and no land, and nothing to offer a woman except the labor of his hands. She was a failed milliner sleeping in other people's barns because a livestock agent had decided her horse belonged to him. There was no future in this. There was no present in this. There was only the pump and the cold and the small economy of a man who did not want to be thanked. Another week passed. The mornings grew darker. She noticed that he had started wearing gloves, not the rough canvas kind the ranch hands wore, but leather, good leather, with stitching that spoke of somewhere else, somewhere with tailors and money and the kind of life that did not end at a frozen pump in Dakota territory. She noticed that his coat, too, was better than it should be, worn now, patched at the elbows, but cut in a way that suggested it had once cost more than everything she owned. She noticed that when he spoke to the clerk at the mercantile, his voice caught on certain words, that he ordered by pointing, that he paid in cash, always and always the exact amount, as though he had counted it out beforehand so he would not have to speak. Another small thing she noticed. He was hiding something in his silence. November came. The quilting circle met every Tuesday. Mrs. Harwell watched Tacy with the particular attention of a woman cataloging evidence. The line shack 12 miles out gained windows, glass ones, hauled from the railhead in a wagon that cost more than it should have. Tacy heard about it from the clerk at the mercantile, who mentioned it with the same puzzled tone people used when they talked about Hamilton Ketcham. A drifting horseman who could afford glass windows. A man who worked with his hands but paid for everything in crisp bills that looked like they had never been folded. She did not ask him about it. She did not ask him about anything. The ritual of the pump did not allow for questions. But she began to wonder. The first snow fell on a Thursday. She was walking to the church in the dark, her boots crunching on the frozen ground, when she saw him ahead of her on the road. He was carrying a bundle under one arm, canvas wrapped around something flat. She slowed. He did not turn. But at the pump, after he had primed it and stepped back, he set the bundle on the edge of the trough. "For the kitchen," he said. His voice was rough, as though the words cost him something. She unwrapped it later, after he had gone. A board, sanded smooth, exactly the right size to cover the gap in the kitchen floor where the cold came through. She had mentioned that gap once to Mrs. Harwell in the quilting circle 3 weeks ago. He had heard, or someone had told him. Either way, he had remembered. She fit the board into the floor that morning. It settled into place as though it had always belonged there, as though he had measured the gap before he cut the wood. Another small thing she noticed. He listened to the things she did not say to him. December. The barns grew colder. The Dawsons let her sleep in the hayloft less often. The soup stretched thinner. Hamilton Ketcham began arriving at the pump with kindling tucked under his arm. Small bundles, dry and split fine, the kind of wood that catches quickly in a cold stove. He never handed them to her. He simply set them by the pump and walked away. She stopped saying thank you. He seemed to prefer it that way. One morning she arrived to find him already gone. The pump was primed. The kindling was stacked, but next to the kindling was something wrapped in cloth. A wool scarf, heavy, blue, the kind of blue that cost money in a place where everyone wore brown. She did not wear it in town. She did not want the questions, but she wore it in the barns at night, wrapped around her neck while she slept. The wool held warmth the way nothing else she owned did. She wondered where a drifting horseman got money for blue wool. She wondered why he had given it to her. She wondered whether he knew that she slept in barns, or whether he only knew that she walked out of them cold every morning, and whether the difference mattered. The ritual continued. The pump, the silence, the small offerings left without explanation. Their fingers almost touched once when she reached for the handle at the same moment he released it. Most. She pulled back. He pulled back. Neither of them mentioned it. But that night, in the Dawson barn, she lay awake for a long time with her hand pressed against the place where his hand had almost been. The mare shifted in her stall. The wind cut through the gaps in the boards. Tacy Briggs was 36 years old, and she had stopped expecting warmth. She had stopped expecting to be seen. She had stopped expecting anything at all from the world except the work of her hands and the slow accumulation of cold mornings, but someone was keeping count. Someone had noticed the gap in the floor, the kindling she could not afford, the scarf she would never have bought herself. Someone had decided, without asking her, that she was worth the trouble of small things. She did not know what to do with that. She had grown up in a house that took in injured range hands. Her father had set bones. Her mother had boiled bandages. She had learned, before she learned anything else, that care was a thing you did with your hands when words were not enough. Hamilton Ketcham did not know this about her. No one in Willow Bend did. But she recognized what he was doing. She recognized the language of it. The kindling and the board and the scarf were not courtship. They were not even kindness. They were witness. He was telling her, in the only way he knew how, that he saw her. The winter deepened. The line shack gained a stove. The pump froze and thawed and froze again. And every morning, in the dark, in the cold, a man who could not speak his own name in public stood at a church pump and primed it for a woman who had stopped expecting to be warm. Vernell Loomis found her at the pump on a Wednesday. He came with two men she did not recognize and a folder of papers pressed against his chest. He was smiling. That was the first thing she noticed. Men who smiled like that had already decided how the conversation would end. "Miss Briggs," he said, "I have been meaning to catch you." She set down the bucket. The water was still running. Hamilton had been there an hour ago. The handle was still cold from his hands. Loomis opened the folder, spread the papers on the edge of the trough as though he were laying out cards. "Your mare," he said. "There is the matter of an outstanding debt. I paid that debt. You paid part of it." He tapped a page she had never seen before. An addendum. "Signed," he said, "by your former business partner in Savannah." Dated 3 weeks before she left. Interest compounding monthly. Tacy looked at the signature. It was close. Not exact, but close enough that a judge who did not want to look too hard would accept it. "I never saw this document." "That is unfortunate," Loomis said. "But a debt is a debt. The mare is forfeit unless you can produce payment in full by the 1st of February. He named a number. It was more than she had earned in 2 years. More than the horse was worth. She understood then. He did not want her to pay. He wanted her to fail. He wanted the mare at auction prices and the satisfaction of watching a woman with no standing lose the last thing she owned. The two men behind him shifted their weight. They were not here to hurt her. They were here to watch. "I will need time to verify this," she said. "You have until February." Loomis gathered his papers. "I would advise you not to make this difficult, Miss Briggs. A woman in your position cannot afford enemies." He walked away. The two men followed. Tacy stood at the pump until her hands stopped shaking. Then she picked up the bucket and carried it inside. She did not go to the pump the next morning, or the morning after that. She told herself it was practical. If Loomis was watching her, if the town was already talking, then being seen with Hamilton Ketcham before dawn would only make things worse. For her, for him, a drifting horseman with money he could not explain and a woman sleeping in barns. The gossip would write itself. She arrived at the church after the water was already primed and the kindling already stacked. She did not look for him on the road. She did not watch for his wagon at the mercantile. The distance opened between them like a wound she was inflicting on herself. Mrs. Harwell stopped her after the quilting circle. "I heard Vernell Loomis came to see you," she said. Her voice was careful. "I heard there is a question about your horse." "There is no question." "The debt was paid." Mrs. Harwell smoothed her gloves. The gesture was familiar now. "A woman your age," she said, "without family, without means. If Loomis says you owe him that animal, the town will believe him. That is simply how these things work." Tacy said nothing. Mrs. Harwell looked at her for a long moment. "You have been seen," she said, "at the pump, early mornings, with the Ketcham man." Tacy felt the blood rise in her face, not from shame, from something else. "He primes the water for the soup kitchen." Mrs. Harwell's expression did not change. "People are talking, Miss Briggs. They are saying you have found a protector. They are saying that is why you have managed to keep that horse this long. That is not true." "I know," Mrs. Harwell said, "but it does not matter what is true. It matters what people believe." Tacy walked home in the dark. The barn was cold. The mare was quiet. She did not go to the pump the next morning either. The storm came 3 days before February. She was walking back from the mercantile when the sky went white. Not the slow darkening of ordinary snow, but a sudden erasure, as though someone had pulled a curtain across the world. The wind came with it, a wind that found every gap in her coat, every seam, every place where the cold could enter. She could not see the road. She could not see the buildings. She could not see anything except the snow driving sideways and the shape of her own hands when she held them in front of her face. She walked anyway. What else was there to do? The Dawson barn was somewhere ahead. The mare was waiting. She walked until her feet stopped feeling like feet, until her hands stopped feeling like hands, until the blue wool scarf around her neck was the only warm thing left in the world. Then she fell. Not a dramatic fall, not a collapse, just the slow giving way of a body that had reached the end of what it could do. The snow was soft. That was the strange thing. Soft and quiet and almost warm, the way cold becomes warm when you stop fighting it. She closed her eyes. When she opened them again, she was inside. A stove, a roof, walls that did not shake in the wind, the smell of wood smoke and something else, coffee maybe, or just the memory of coffee. She was lying on a cot near the stove. A blanket covered her. Not one blanket, 3. Hamilton Ketcham was sitting on a stool by the door, his hat in his hands, watching her. She tried to speak. Her throat was raw with cold. He stood, crossed to the stove, poured something from a pot into a cup, and brought it to her. When she tried to sit up, he put one hand behind her shoulder and lifted, not gently, efficiently, the way you lift something that needs to be moved. The cup was warm. The liquid inside was weak tea with honey. She drank it in small sips while the feeling came back to her hands. "The line shack," she said finally. He nodded. "How?" "Found you," he said, "on the road." She looked at him, at the snow melting in his hair, at the wet patches on his coat where he had carried her through the storm, at the stove he had built, and the walls he had raised, and the glass windows he had hauled from the railhead. Why? He did not answer. He took the cup from her hands and set it on the stove. Then he sat back down on the stool and looked at the floor. The wind screamed outside. The windows held. The stove burned low and steady. She realized in the silence that he had been shaking, not from cold, from something else. I grew up in a house that took in injured range hands, she said. She did not know why she was saying it. It had nothing to do with the storm or the line shack or the question she had asked. But it came out anyway. My father set bones, she said. My mother boiled bandages. I learned how to splint a broken leg before I learned how to read. He looked up. I was not always a milliner, she said. I was not always someone who lost things. I used to be useful. I used to be the person people called when there was no doctor and no time to wait for one. The fire cracked. The wind dropped for a moment and then rose again. He stood, crossed to the cot, sat on the edge of it, close enough that she could see the pulse in his throat. I have been keeping count, he said. His voice caught on the words, not a stammer, something worse. The sound of a man forcing language through a throat that did not want to let it pass. Every barn, he said, every cold morning you walked out of someone else's hayloft and pretended you had slept somewhere warm. She stared at him. 3 months, he said, 91 mornings. I know because I counted. Why? He looked at her. His hands were clenched on his knees. His jaw was tight with the effort of speaking. Because someone should, he said. The fire burned. The storm howled. The line shack held. She understood then what the windows were for, what the stove was for, what the careful walls and the latching door and the 3 blankets on the cot were for. He had built this place for her, not as a gift, not as a courtship, as witness, as proof that someone had seen her, had counted her mornings, had decided she was worth a roof and a fire and a door that locked against the wind. The spare room, he said. His voice was steadier now, or maybe she was just learning to hear it. At the boarding house in town. I paid for it last week. Through February. Past Loomis's deadline. She shook her head. I cannot accept that. Already done. I cannot repay you. He looked at her. Something shifted in his face. You splint bones, he said. That is worth more than a room. I have not done that in years. Does not matter. He stood, crossed to the stove, poured more tea into the cup. The knowing stays. I watched my mother forget how to do everything except the one thing she learned first. At the end, she could not remember my name, but she could still hem a dress. He brought the cup back to her. His hands were steady now. The shaking had stopped. You are not a woman who lost things, he said. You are a woman who kept the one thing that matters. She looked at him, at his weathered face and his careful hands, and the silence he wrapped around himself like armor. What thing? He almost smiled. The knowing, he said, the useful part. Everything else is just weather. The storm lasted until morning. She slept on the cot. He slept on the floor by the stove, his coat rolled under his head. When she woke, the wind had stopped. The sky was white and still. He was already up, already dressed, already holding the door open so the light could come in. The road is clear, he said. I will walk you back. She stood, wrapped the blue scarf around her neck, looked at the room he had built board by board through the autumn while she slept in other people's barns. Thank you. He shook his head. Not thanks, he said. Not between us. Then what? He looked at her for a long moment. Just this, he said. Just morning. The road back to town was not empty. A wagon had gone off the track 1/2 mile from the line shack. The storm had buried it to the axles. 2 men were digging. A third was lying in the snow with his leg bent wrong. Hamilton stopped walking. Tacy stopped beside him. She saw the angle of the bone before she saw the man's face. A clean break, or close to it. The kind that healed straight if you set it fast, and healed crooked if you waited for a doctor a full day's ride out. She was kneeling in the snow before she knew she had moved. The man's name was Carver. He worked cattle for a spread east of town. He was maybe 45, maybe older, with a face that had seen too much weather, and hands that had done too much work. He looked at her with the flat animal patience of a man who had already decided this was going to hurt. She did not ask permission. She did not explain. She put her hands on the brake and felt the edges of bone beneath the skin and remembered her father's voice in a kitchen 20 years ago, telling her where to press and how much and when. "Hold him," she said to the men standing over her. They held him. She set the bone. Carver did not scream. He made a sound like air leaving a bellows, low and long, and then he was quiet. His eyes were closed. His breathing was even. The men looked at her as though she had performed a miracle. She had not. She had done the one thing she had learned before she learned anything else. She splinted the leg with branches from the roadside and strips torn from her own petticoat. Hamilton did not help. He stood to one side and watched, and when she was finished, he helped the men lift Carver into the wagon. They drove toward town. She walked beside them. Hamilton walked beside her. Neither of them spoke. By noon, the story had reached the mercantile. By evening, it had reached the quilting circle. By the following Tuesday, when Tacy climbed the stairs above the mercantile, the women were already talking. Mrs. Harwell met her at the door. "I heard about Carver," she said. "I heard you set that leg better than Doc Morrison could have." Tacy said nothing. Mrs. Harwell smoothed her gloves. The gesture had lost its edge. "You learned that somewhere," she said. "That is not a skill you pick up making soup." "My father," Tacy said. He took in range hands. Mrs. Harwell looked at her for a long moment. Then she stepped aside and let Tacy enter. The women at the quilting circle did not ask about Vernell Loomis. They did not ask about the mare, or the debt, or the paperwork from Savannah. They asked about bone setting. They asked about her father. They asked what else she knew how to do that she had not mentioned. Tacy answered, "Not much, just enough." She noticed over the following days that people had started nodding to her on the street. Not the dismissive nod of a woman without property. Something else. The nod you gave to someone who had proved herself useful. Carver's foreman came to see her at the church kitchen. He brought a ham. He said his wife wanted to know if Tacy would come to dinner sometime. The clerk at the mercantile mentioned, in passing, that someone from the territorial registrar's office had been asking questions about Vernell Loomis, something about a pattern of claims that did not match the signatures on file. Tacy did not ask what that meant. She did not need to. February came. Loomis did not. She heard later that he had left town. Some business in Cheyenne, people said, though no one seemed to know what business or whether he would return. His papers had been examined. His claims had been questioned. The mare belonged to Tacy Briggs because it had always belonged to Tacy Briggs, and the town had simply stopped pretending otherwise. No one apologized. No one admitted they had been wrong. They simply started treating her as though she had always been worth the trouble of seeing. That was how it worked. That was how it had always worked. You did not win by fighting. You won by being the person you had always been, and waiting for the world to catch up. Spring came the way it always does in that country, slow, grudging. One morning the ice on the pump handle was gone, and the next morning it stayed gone. Tacy Briggs walked to the line shack on the first warm Saturday in April. The road was muddy. The sky was that pale, clean blue that only happens after a hard winter finally breaks. He was outside when she arrived, mending a fence post, his sleeves rolled to the elbow, his hands steady on the work. She stopped at the edge of the yard. He looked up. "I brought something," she said. She held out the blue scarf, folded, clean, the wool still heavy with the warmth it had held through all those barn nights. He set down his tools, crossed the yard, stopped close enough that she could see the lines around his eyes, the gray coming in at his temples, the careful way he held himself when he was not sure what to say. "Keep it," he said. She shook her head. "I do not need it any more." He looked at her, at the scarf, at her hands holding it out to him. Then he reached past the scarf and took her hand instead, not pulling, not grasping, just holding, the way you hold something you have been waiting to hold for a long time. She did not pull away. "No counting now," he said. His voice was quiet, steady, the stammer nowhere in it. No more mornings to keep track of. She looked at their hands, at the calluses on his palms, at the way his fingers fit around hers like they had always known the shape. She thought about the pump, the kindling, the board cut to fit a gap in a floor, the windows hauled from the railhead, the room he had paid for without asking, the cot with 3 blankets, the stove that burned all night, all those small things, all that witness. She stepped closer. He did not move away. The scarf fell between them. Neither of them picked it up. When I think about them standing there in that muddy yard, I think about all the ways we learn to be seen, not through grand gestures, not through declarations, through the slow accumulation of mornings, through someone deciding, without asking, that we are worth the trouble of counting. That is the love story underneath the love story, the one that happens before anyone says a word. If this story stayed with you, tell me where you are listening from and what moment touched you most. If you would like more quiet evenings by the fire, lonely roads, quiet cowboys, and hearts finding their way home, come back for the next one. Subscribe if you have not already. I will be here. Thank you for staying to the very end. I will see you in the next one.